Well, thank you very much for inviting me today. And so I'm going to give you a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about today. So first of all, I'm going to give you a little bit about me. Then I'm going to talk about theories. And so it's going to be a little bit abstract, but I'll tell you where I'm going with this. And then that's going to lead into talking about culture. And so when I had to give a title 6 months ago, I wasn't really sure what I was going to talk about. It was only through developing the talk today that I came up with what I'm doing. And so it's really going to focus a lot on culture and psychology, and how culture affects theories, language, and psychology. And I'll talk a little bit about stress and coping, because that's my particular area of research interest, and especially negative mood regulation. So that's my particular focus. And then that's going to lead back into culture again to talk about culture and emotion. And finally, get more specifically to talk about Japan and some important Japanese values, and then challenges in Japan. So Japan really is a society that's being transformed now by demographic forces. And I'll talk about a few principles of Japanese psychology that are kind of things that I've been thinking about, and then also some potential solutions to the problems that are facing Japan. So first of all, about me, my PhD is in clinical psychology. And clinical psychologists are the people who treat people with mental health problems. So I have training in therapy, and as Janice said, I'm the coordinator of the MS program, which trains people to be therapists. And my PhD is from University of Connecticut. And I've been here for a long time, so I'm getting ready to join you as a retiree. Sometimes it's not soon enough. But yeah, so I've been here for over 25 years. I was department chair. I've been coordinating the program for 20 years now. And my research interests are about how people cope with stress, and particularly about how they deal with the negative moods that they experience. And what I look at especially is their confidence about, can they control the negative moods or not? So when you're feeling upset, can you do something to make yourself feel better? And over the last 10 years or so, I've become increasingly interested in the cultural impact of people's emotions, and particularly emotions and psychotherapy. And so in fall 2016, I did a Fulbright at the University of Tokyo in the Department of Clinical Psychology. And what a Fulbright does is it exchanges scholars and students between countries. And it's a wonderful opportunity, because the idea first started by Senator Fulbright after World War II to help people around the world adopt American views, adopt American values. And so by getting people from other countries to come here, by sending Americans abroad, there are these cultural exchanges. So it's a wonderful thing. And so this is a picture of me with the students in Japan. You see if you can pick me out here. It's a tough one. And so when I was there, I taught a couple of classes to graduate students in Japan, and also collaborated on research with them. In particular, what I was interested in is how applicable are Western ideas to doing psychotherapy and the practice of clinical psychology in Japan in general. And part of what was great about the Fulbright is I went there by myself. I had tremendous amounts of time to spend on my own. And so I just wandered all over the place. And so being there was like a laboratory. So I got to watch Japanese people on the sidewalks, in the subways, all over the place. And so my observations of Japanese people and talking with the professors and the students at the University of Tokyo, all these informed the questions that I am going to talk about today. All right, so some caveats. Not really caveats, but they're kind of things to keep in mind. First of all, I'm going to start very generally, and then I'm going to get more narrow in the focus and move more toward Japan specifically. Another thing, and this is more of an actual caveat, is that Western and Eastern, which I'm going to be using, are gross overgeneralizations, okay? But this is the way the literature is. So the literature talks about Western and Eastern as if they're like two completely different things. And it overlooks the fact that, you know, under Eastern are many, many different cultures that have many differences. So it just kind of lumps them together. So I understand that that is not fair to the different cultures that go into this. That is the way the field is. And so within it, and also, you know, not just different nations behave differently, but within any given culture, people behave differently too. So it's not like everybody from a particular place is exactly the same. So there's a lot of overgeneralization in this. And on the one hand, I acknowledge it. On the other hand, I have to use the terminology that's out there. So that's the way it goes. And in addition to, you know, individual differences, there are male-female differences, there are racial differences, regional, if you're from the country, you're from the city, there are different influences on your behavior, religious differences, economic status differences, effects of individual upbringing. So many different things that affect people besides just kind of the general region of the world that people are from. So one of the implications of this is that the differences between East and West are exaggerated, and the literature implies that there are differences in kind rather than degree. So you know, it sounds a lot like, you know, all Americans are like this, and all Japanese are like this. And obviously that's not true, that there's some overlap between people. So, so again, keep that in mind, that when I talk about differences, that these can seem greater than they actually are. All right, so let's talk about theories in general. So how many facts are there in the room right now? How about an infinite number of facts? Okay, so there are all sorts of different things, from things that are so inconsequential, we're not even going to pay attention to them at all, to things that are more important. So, but you know, anywhere that we go, there's an overwhelming amount of information that comes into our senses. And so we always have to decide what is important to pay attention to, what is it that we should ignore, what is it that should we focus on. So that's something that, just to get around in life, you have to be able to filter out what is not important. So the environment's very complex. We have to be able to organize information, organize facts, our observations. Okay. So in science, theories are what structure information. So we use theories to apply them to what we observe to make sense of what is going on. And one of the quotes I like is from a psychologist named Kurt Lewin. And what he says is that there is nothing as practical as a good theory. And this is kind of a paradox, because on the one hand, a theory is something that's very abstract. But what Lewin points out is that an abstract theory actually has very important practical benefits because of that ability to organize. So if you have a good theory, it helps you make sense of things that are difficult to make sense of. All right, so in psychology, there are 4 different functions that theories perform, or clinical psychology in particular. So the first of these is it gives a language for description. So it gives you terms. So different theories will have different terms, different variables, different names for things. So if you have good theory, this allows you to communicate with other people. So you share a common language. It allows you to communicate your observations to other people. You have agreement about that. Second function of a theory is that it explains development over time. So if you see someone today and you observe that person's behavior, you can make certain assumptions about what must have happened in that person's past. So a theory connects what's going on right now with what we assume happened previously. And we could go in the other direction too, that the theory allows us to make predictions about future behavior. So if we put different people in the same situation, they're going to behave differently. That's what we call individual differences in psychology. And so the idea here is that our theory allows us to connect different characteristics that people have with how they're going to respond to different situations. And then lastly, particularly for clinical psychology, the theory allows us to predict how people will respond to psychotherapy. And what I tell my students is that I think every therapy session is a little experiment. So the therapist comes in makes some hypotheses about how his or her interventions are going to affect the client, makes those interventions, collects data about how those interventions are working, and then changes the assessment if it's not working. And so our theory gives us the ability to connect what's going on with the client and how the therapist's interventions are going to affect the client. Okay. All right, so let's start talking about culture. So a quote I've come across is that culture is to people like water is to fish. Okay. So that's because it completely surrounds us. And it broadly shapes our worldview, but we're not necessarily aware of its influence. And so fish don't know that they're in water. That's the environment that they're in. So we don't really necessarily know that we are in our culture unless we come up against some other culture that is different. And so what is the function of culture, or how does culture affect us? First of all, it tells us what is important. So when we are born into a particular culture, it tells us what are the facts that are most important to focus on. What are the most important elements of life that we need to know about. Also, it shapes us individually. Culture tells us what values we should have. It tells us what aspirations we should have. What should we try to be? What's a good person? What is a successful person? And it sets up rewards and punishments for certain kinds of behavior. And so, if we disobey our culture, then other people are not going to think nicely about us. They are not going to respond well to us. And so our culture sets up what we should expect, or how we should expect other people to react to us. Right? And so, one of the things about Japan is that it's a heavily Buddhist country. And I've been reading this book, Why Buddhism is True by Robert Wright. And one of the quotes that I really like about it is, it says, one big lesson for Buddhism is to be suspicious of the intuition that your ordinary way of perceiving the world brings you the truth about it. Okay? So what does this quote mean? Well, first of all, it's very consistent with Western approaches to psychology. So, the whole idea about psychotherapy is that you want people to move away from their irrational view of the world and take on a healthier perspective. And that's true whether you're a Freudian or you're a cognitive behavioral person. The idea is to escape the flawed subjective view that you have of yourself and the world and attain a more realistic, more objective viewpoint. And so that you want to overcome your own individual biases. Now, in addition to that, this quote about Buddhism is also true about the scientific method in general. So the whole idea about the scientific method is that we want to be objective. And how we do that is by collecting data. And so if we collect data and we're careful about it, then we want to overcome our subjective bias. And so in science, we use theories to structure our perceptions, our understanding, and the theories allow us to test our hypotheses. So we test hypotheses as a way of trying to be more objective. And testing these hypotheses allows us to either verify or invalidate our ideas about how things work. So culture affects our worldview, and our worldview affects our theories of mind and behavior. And so theories are going to differ between different cultures. So let's talk about culture in psychology. So here again, this reminding us about the caveat of this is a gross overgeneralization, but admitting that, I would just plunge right in. So the Western view of people is that people are composed of discrete characteristics that we carry around with us. Okay? So you have certain traits or qualities that make up who you are. And you're always the same person regardless of where you go. So you're essentially the same person you are here as you are when you're at home, when you're out with your friends, that you're basically the same person because you carry yourself with you. You always are the same person. And these internal characteristics dictate our actions, or largely. Obviously, if you're not completely rigid, you change your behavior from one situation to another. But overall, you are going to behave the same way. You're going to be a recognizable person from one place to another. The other influence here of culture is in terms of maturation. So what is the goal of maturing, of getting older? And in the West, it is that you are supposed to develop your core characteristics. So you become more fully yourself. You develop your potential, and that means fulfilling your own desires. So, you have something in life that you want to do, you pursue it, and that may mean that you are not necessarily paying attention to what other people want or other people's feelings about it. Now, the Eastern approach to self is the opposite. And so the idea here is that who you are as a person is less important than your relationships with other people. So the person that you're interacting with is more important in terms of determining your behavior. And so you are going to be a different person if you are interacting with your family than if you're interacting with friends and you're interacting with people at work. So who you are is much more fluid than what we would talk about in the West. The other thing about the Eastern approach in terms of maturation is that, when we're a kid, we're selfish, we are self-centered, and the idea is as you mature, you give up that self-centeredness and you develop more of an other-centeredness. And so, in the West, you're supposed to become more and more yourself, more and more an individual. But in the East, you're supposed to become less and less an individual and more a part of the group. And so the harmony of the group is much more important than fulfilling your own desires. And so, if it's a conflict between what you want and what other people want, the Eastern value is that you are going to focus on what others want as opposed to what you want. All right, so theory and culture. So it's a very Western idea that an abstract theory will explain everything about all people. So we can come up with a theory and apply it, and that's going to explain everything. So basically, that there's this set of rules or universal principles that will explain everything. But essentially, the Western view is this: is that if we have the right set of principles, the world is essentially simple and easily understood. Okay? So all about Western science is finding the right set of rules to make the world very simple and understandable. And so theories prioritize what we need to know. So we want to throw out everything that's not important and focus on the most important narrow group of facts. And that is going to give us the most understanding. So basically, what's the basic set of information that we need to know? Another thing that's important is, for the Western viewpoint, theories are universal. So if a theory is good, it applies to everything. Okay? So it's not relative, it applies all over. And then very important is the idea of truth from a Western perspective. So if something is true, it is always true. Okay? So if something is true, it cannot be false. And if it's really true, it can't be true now and then turn out to be false later. So truth is always true. It's objective and it's true for everybody. And the other thing that's very important is that simplifying makes us approach this enduring permanent truth. And so that's the goal of the Western approach to science, is to simplify. You can see this in particular in physics. Physics wants to get down to the smallest particles. And they keep discovering smaller and smaller particles. That's what they want. And eventually, you're going to get the basic building blocks of everything once you get rid of all the other stuff that you don't need to know about. So there's a small set of something that everything else is built on. And you just have to discover what that set is. Now, the Asian view is quite different from that. So the Asian view is that the world is very complex. And simplifying actually makes things less understandable. So if you're throwing out information because you think it's not important, that's actually valuable information. And so you're going to lose track of something that's important. And the basic idea is that everything's related to everything else. And so if you try to ignore some of these relationships, you're missing out on some of what's really important. And the thing is that this complexity makes things less predictable. Okay? And I think the Western approach would agree with that, but the Western approach would say, if it makes things less predictable, let's make it less complex. But the Eastern view is that things are naturally less predictable. So you have to embrace that complexity. The other thing is that change and the unexpected are to be expected. So, so the idea about this enduring truth also does not fit the Eastern approach. So the idea is that basically the world is very complex, and the rules themselves are constantly changing. So if you have a good theory now, it's not necessarily going to be a good theory in the future. The reasons that things happen change over time. And so what this means from the Eastern perspective is that truth changes over time, and that truth is subjective. Okay? So it's very much the opposite of the Western approach. And the idea is that truth is mutually constructed. So, it's not that, the Western approach would be like, I'm talking to you, I'm telling you what the truth is. The Eastern approach is that I'm talking to you and I'm talking about an element of truth, but the way you understand it also is contributing. So the truth is a mutual contribution of both of us, the speaker and the listener. And that means the truth is going to change depending on who I'm talking to. So all of you are going to have a slightly different understanding of what I'm talking about. And so that means that the truth, there are as many different truths here as there are people in the audience. Okay. All right, and then, so let's talk about language now. So language and culture. And so the Western focus is on clarity and directness of language. So the goal is to express everything very clearly and concisely. But the Asian approach is different from that. And so the idea is that language cannot, and not just cannot, but should not fully explain or express one's intent. And so again, this is that idea of the mutual construction. For me as someone who started to learn Japanese late in life and is not tremendously great at Japanese, this posed a lot of problems because in Japan, you never say 100% clearly what you want. And so, because that doing so insults the listener. Because if I tell you completely what I want you to understand, then you have no contribution to it. So I have to allow you to do that. And there's something called harage, which is the capacity to intuit what others want. And so that's what you as a listener do. So you figure out, oh, well, this is what he wants me to understand. And you intuit it so I don't have to express it. The problem is that, if at best, I can understand maybe 90% of anything that someone was saying. And what I discovered was that a lot of times, the most important stuff was in the 10% that really wasn't spoken clearly. So there were many times where I realized that people wanted me to do something, but they didn't say it. And so finally, I would just have to say, are you saying you want me to do this? And then they could say yes. But yeah, it was really baffling for me because my approach to language is different from the Japanese approach. So we'll talk about differences in terms of language. So, English values precision, clarity, universality. And so we want to accurately convey facts. And so, when we talk about English, we're always talking about like who's doing what, how much of something there is. So numbers, facts are important. But in Japanese, it's much vaguer, and the relationships outweigh the facts. So expressing facts is not necessarily as important as how the relationship is between speaker and listener. One of the things that is kind of baffling is Japanese often don't use pronouns. And so sometimes it's hard to know who's doing the action because they're not saying. The other thing is that they don't pluralize nouns. And so, this happened to one thing, did it happen to more than one thing? Doesn't really matter as much. And the other thing that's very important is that the language actually changes depending on the relationship between the speaker and the listener. And so, particularly status differences. So if you're speaking to someone who is close to you, like a family member, use different language than if you are speaking to someone you don't know as well. And if there's someone who is above you in status, then use even different language. And so this means, use different verb endings, and sometimes the nouns themselves are different. And there are all these extra polite words, which again was something that was very difficult for me. So when you're trying to listen very carefully and figure out what people are saying, if they've got extra stuff that is just being polite, you have to filter all that out. It's difficult to do that. So my wife had, this is her, she didn't speak Japanese at all, but this is, from my description, this is her, translation of Japanese. And it's something like nice, nice, fact, fact, nice, nice, fact, fact, nice. And so you have to just get rid of all those nices to really understand what the facts are, at least from an American perspective. All right, so let's summarize where we've gotten to at this point. So first of all, the Western idea is that if we have the right rules, all events will follow from them. So everything is predictable forever. That's if we really know what's going on. And simplifying increases the understanding, and that we can eliminate contradictions, and ultimately the world is rational. We just have to figure out how to see it that way. And something is either true or false. It cannot be both. And the goal is to boil things down to their basic essence. We see this idea in Western psychology. First of all, there's a big emphasis in clinical psychology on diagnosis. So diagnosis is you find out what mental disorder the person has. And this one label tells you all sorts of information about that person. So why do they have the disorder? What kind of symptoms do they have? What kind of treatment do they need? So all of these different things. The other thing that we see too is a belief about cause. And so, the Western view is that any given behavior ultimately should be traceable back to a single cause. So there's some why about why it happened. And ultimately you should be able to find it. Now, the Asian view, in contrast, says that simplifying ignores important information and ultimately leads to less understanding. It also ignores the fact that the world is constantly changing, and that when you change the context, you change the thing itself. And the contradictions are natural. So here's a quote that I still cannot completely grasp myself, but the opposite of a great truth is also true. So as a Westerner, this doesn't make any sense to me. So it's very hard, and this is the thing that I've struggled with trying to understand Japan, is breaking out of my own way of viewing the things. And so it's still hard for me to accept that the opposite of a great truth is also true. But that is the more Eastern approach. So the Asian approach is suspicious of simplicity, and cause is multifaceted. So you're not going to be able to trace it back to one single thing. There are many, many contributions to it. And you can always go back further in time as well. So if you go back 5 years, well, there was a cause for that thing 5 years ago. So you can always go back, you can always look at other events as well. All right, so there's a broad classification in the cultural literature of societies into independent versus interdependent. And there's also, they sometimes call them individualistic versus collectivistic. And independent means that individuals focus on pursuing their own personal goals, and they try to maximize their own well-being. So this is like the overall value. And this is valued more by the West. And then interdependent means that the focus is more on shared and group goals and group well-being, so the individual needs are not as important. And this is valued more in Asian cultures. All right. So I'll talk briefly about the research that I do, which is on stress and coping. And so stressors are events that tax our psychic resources. So something happens, it's challenging to you, it's upsetting to you, it makes you have to deal with it. And so it forces us to cope with that. And there's a general dichotomy of coping responses. And so on the one hand, we have active or problem-focused type of coping. And the idea here is that we work to try to change the stressful situation. So there's some stressor that's bothering us, and we try to make that stressor go away or try to fix the situation. The other side is called avoidant coping. And avoidant coping means that the focus is on feeling less upset about what's going on, but you don't necessarily do anything to make that stressor go away. And so the problem with this is that your upset, your distress, may be temporarily fixed, but the stressor is still there, so you're going to have to deal with it in the future. And there's a lot of research in the West that shows that it's more healthy and more adaptive to cope in an active way. And that avoidance tends to cause long-term problems. And so emotion regulation is basically how you cope with negative feelings. So when you're upset, and the two approaches to this parallel what we talk about with coping in general. So one approach is called reappraisal, and reappraisal is reevaluating the situation and trying to find something positive in it. So something upsetting happens, what can you learn from it? Or what can you see in it that maybe is a benefit? So this is like finding a silver lining in something that's upsetting. The opposite of that is suppression. And suppression is just trying not to feel bad. So you don't really try to change the situation, you just try not to experience the upset. And the idea is that this should actually make people feel worse because you have to use energy to bottle it up. And where do those feelings go? And so, you know, they don't just disappear, they've got to be somewhere. And research shows that both reappraisal and suppression reduce expressive emotion. So if people are upset about something and they're told to either reappraise or to suppress, they look less emotional. But suppression, people tend to show physiological arousal even though they're not visibly emotional, whereas people who are reappraising don't have that physiological arousal. So it looks like that suppression is actually maladaptive because you may not be obviously experiencing the emotion, but at some level, there's some sort of conflict that is going on. All right, and so in the West, suppressing the emotion has a paradoxical effect. So when you try to avoid the emotion, often it actually makes it more likely that you're going to experience that. So a lot of people experience anxiety about various things, and so if you are anticipating some situation that you are going to feel anxious in, and you tell yourself, I can't feel anxious, I can't let myself feel anxious, that actually makes it more likely that you're going to feel anxiety. Okay? And so what we have is a vicious cycle. And you start off with emotional distress of some sort, and that leads to attempts at suppression. So you don't want to feel that distress, so you try to suppress it. But that suppression actually intensifies that negative affect, and then that increases your emotional distress. So the more people engage in suppression, the more upset they end up feeling, at least in the West. And eventually that leads to symptoms of psychopathology, because people are maladaptively trying to avoid these bad feelings, which just makes them feel worse in the long run. And it takes up progressively more and more effort. So when your suppression is not working and you're feeling more and more upset, you have to devote more and more energy to continuing to suppress. The other thing is that you don't have energy left to cope in a healthy way. All right. So my particular area of research is on something called negative mood regulation expectancy. And expectancy is your level of confidence about the outcome of your behavior. So will it be successful or not? So if you have a strong expectancy, that means you have a high degree of confidence that if you engage in this behavior, it will have a particular outcome. And so what I'm particularly interested in is this expectancy for negative mood regulation. And so that's the confidence that you have the ability to make yourself feel better. So when you're feeling bad, you can do something to stop feeling upset. So we have a lot of research. I've been doing this for 30 years now. And so strong expectancies predict successful coping attempts. And they also lead to more adaptive coping, less negative affect, and better health. So these negative mood regulation expectancies appear to be something that really bolsters well-being. And there are two different pathways that these expectancies influence our mood. The first of these is a direct effect. And so if you have these strong negative mood regulation expectancies, those will directly influence your mood because simply believing that you can feel better will make you feel better. And so this is similar to the placebo effect. So placebo effect is that if you take a pill, even if the pill has no medicinal value, you will feel better because of the belief that that pill will make you feel better. So same thing is true for this. If something bad happens to you and you think, I can handle it, you will feel better simply because you have that belief that you can handle it. But there's also an indirect effect as well. And so that is that the mood regulation beliefs lead you to cope more adaptively, and that those adaptive coping efforts will lead you to be in a better mood as well. And so a colleague of mine, Sam Catanzaro, and I developed the mood regulation, a negative mood regulation scale to measure these beliefs. And it has 30 items that complete the stem. When I'm upset, I believe that. And so people respond from strongly disagree, strongly agree. And example items are things like, I can do something to feel better, or planning how I'll deal with things will help. Okay. And so in the last 10 years or so, we've translated the scale into many different languages, and including Japanese. And particularly for the Asian languages, we've made culturally sensitive translations. And so what this means is that rather than just literal translations where you take the language, you take English and use the same items and wording in a different, you translate to a different language, we actually have new items that reflect ways that this different culture engages in mood regulation that Westerners and Americans may not. And so this is something that has been very important to me, is really capture the nuance of these mood regulation behaviors across cultures. All right, so let's get back to culture again and talk about culture in the self. And this is, so we've already touched on this a bit, so let's get back. So in America, people define themselves by their individual traits. So you tend to see yourself by your personal qualities, and we see ourselves as stable across situations. So the self is autonomous, it's self-contained. You carry yourself with you, it's always with you, you can't get rid of it. And you are distinct from other people, so yourself is different from other people. And as we mentioned, the developmental ideal is to develop your individual characteristics and to express them fully. And social relationships from the Western perspective are basically avenues for expressing yourself. And so other people are more ways that we gauge how we're doing. They are people who give us responses that we are looking for, but it's a much more kind of transactional approach. And the idea is that the American nightmare is to fail to distinguish oneself from others. And so the idea is that we want to be unique on some level. We want to be different. In contrast, Japanese value harmonious interconnectedness. And what this means is that emotions, the experience of emotions, the expression of emotions, is very influenced by the effect that emotions have on other people. And relationships are what they call the unit of consciousness. So you're not focused on what's going on with you, you're focused on what's going on with us. And so the focus is on making sure that you are in sync with other people. And the overriding motive is to promote the collective welfare. So not so much what you want, but what everybody wants, what's good for everybody. And so the self is determined by relationships with others. So it's not so much that you are the same person in all situations, but rather that you are different depending on who you are relating to. And so these internal attributes are more situation specific. And as we mentioned before, that maturation is learning to voluntarily control your desires. So you become less focused on the self and more focused on others. And so what this means is that, you know, for a Japanese person, you have to constantly be aware of what is going on with other people. What do other people want? What do other people need? And you have to regard other people's goals as your own. And so it's not enough just to focus on what you want, but you have to focus on what other people want as well. And so, you know, the Western consistency is seen as being very rigid and inflexible. And then the Japanese nightmare is exclusion from the group. And so to not fit in, to not be a part, not belong, that is frightening for Japanese people. All right, so self-control. So, in America, self-control is asserting your individuality, and you may you try to alter the interpersonal context to try to express yourself. And so the idea here is that relationships may be more vehicles for expressing your personal goals or reaching your personal goals. In contrast, in Japan, you're more likely to subsume your personal goals in favor of harmony. So you do things to benefit others. And you get self-esteem from making sure that you're fitting in well with others, as opposed to that you are setting yourself apart. And so the idea here is that relationships are ends in themselves. They're not something that you benefit from, but just the fact that we're all getting along, that is very important. And so in relation to this, culture and emotion. So emotional experience and expression are inherently social. So we evolved emotions and facial expressions that represent emotions because they perform some sort of social function. So emotions tell other people what's going on with us. And even if we try to keep that private, we are not necessarily able to do that. And so emotions are very public things. So what that means is that there is always something social about emotional experiences. And the research shows that Americans tend to experience emotions longer, tend to experience emotions more intensely than Japanese people do. Another thing that's important is that Westerners value authenticity. So if you're feeling something, you should express it. That your public self and your internal self, we feel like there should be a connection. There should be a similarity. For Japanese people, the social context is much more important than the internal feeling. And so that means that there may be a disconnect between how someone's feeling inside and the kind of emotion that someone is expressing outwardly. And so the idea is that for Japanese people, there is a decision, it may not be a conscious decision, but there's a decision to express certain emotions because that is what the social situation calls for. And it may not correspond at all to internal feelings. And so one of the things that I discovered in Japan is that apologizing is very important. And it may be important even when you've done nothing wrong. And so again, this is something that as a Westerner, there's this idea of fairness. And I shouldn't be forced to apologize for something if I didn't do anything wrong. But in Japan, the fact that you're apologizing, if you feel some sort of conflict over apologizing for something you didn't do, that is less important than apologizing and making other people feel better. So that's something that I observed in Japan, was expected, and I observed people doing it, was that even if people did nothing wrong, they would apologize because that makes things nice and it increases that collective harmony. And so in Japan, people will avoid expressing certain emotions like anger, particularly to people that they are close to. So again, your own internal feelings are not as important as the effect that expressing those feelings may have on other people. One of the other things that's important too is that, this idea about positive versus negative emotions. And the West values pursuing positive emotions. And, a lot of times if people are experiencing negative emotions, there is an evaluation that people are not controlling themselves or people are not doing the right thing, that they should be able to make themselves feel better. And in America, the pursuit of happiness is an inalienable right. It's in the Declaration of Independence, right? So we all should be pursuing happiness. We all should be trying to be feeling good. So it's a very important value in America. In Asia, though, the idea that life is constantly changing and comprises opposites, that means that the difference between positive and negative emotions is not the same as we see it in the West. And so negative emotions have desirable aspects to them. First of all, they may motivate people. So if you feel guilty, that may motivate you to improve your behavior. But they also have social functions as well. And so, if you express your negative emotions properly, that will increase your social harmony. All right, so culture and psychotherapy. And so first of all, this is one of the reasons I wanted to go to Japan, was the idea about, well, what can we import from the West to be useful in Japan? And what I found is that a lot of the Western standards that guide psychotherapy violate Japanese cultural assumptions. And so first of all, Japanese may just resist offers for help. And so this is maybe seen as intrusive. So if you say, do you need help, that may be offensive to somebody. Particularly, even if they feel like they need help, the fact that someone else sees them as needing help, that could be offensive. The other thing is that silence is seen as a virtue. And so psychotherapy, you pretty much need to talk to each other. And in Japanese psychotherapy, it can go very slowly because the therapist does not want to stop this or jump in when there's silence. The other thing is this indirect communication and the verbal ambiguity. That is a problem. So in the West, we want to teach our clients to express themselves more clearly. But in Japan, expressing yourself more clearly is not necessarily a value. So that is a problem. There also is a very strong sense of deferring to elders and authorities. And so, in psychotherapy, there are different, depending on your approach, there may be differences in the client-therapist relationship in terms of status. But basically, ultimately, there are two people in the room with each other. And so it is a social interaction. But in Japan, it's harder to do that. So if you are a doctor or you are a professional, it's hard to have someone respond to you as a person. So there's always going to be that deference. And that makes it harder. So someone may go along with what you're saying in the session, but they're really not learning anything. They're just trying to please the therapist. And then lastly, there's a big stigma surrounding mental health problems in Japan. Also, that shame is important. So that gets back into whether people are really going to admit that they have a problem. And so certain responsive feelings may be unacceptable. So that's true in the West, but the idea is to help people be more accepting of those. But in Japan, that has to overcome this prohibition against having certain qualities that do not fit with the group norm. Another Japanese value that's very important, and this is something that I, as a Westerner, again, have to struggle with understanding completely, is being versus doing. And Americans value actively changing a problem. So if something's not going right, you fix it. And the American value is you pull yourself up by your bootstraps. So you take charge, you accomplish things. But the Japanese approach is different. So there's much more of acceptance. So rather than trying to change the problem that's bothering you, there's much more of a focus on accepting it. And so that's being rather than doing. And so these are things like mindfulness, which is becoming more popular in the US now, meditation. And the idea here is that you are not trying to change the situation or change your uncomfortable feelings, but rather you just develop this tolerance or acceptance for discomfort or imperfection. And when you are being rather than doing, you can focus on how you are feeling, what your reactions are, without having to feel like you need to change them. So there's that focus on acceptance. And there's also a focus much more on what is happening in the moment. So not what you want to accomplish in the future, not what you plan to do, but what's happening right now. And then lastly, the focus with being is to experience things directly. So Americans tend to think about stuff. We tend to intellectualize. And even though the Japanese are, on the one hand, I would say, they come across as being less feeling-oriented. In this sense, it's more feeling-oriented. It's more intuitive. So they don't try to think about what's going on, just accept it and experience it directly. Another very important Japanese value is something that they learn really early, which is it's the nail that sticks up is hammered down. And this means that you're not supposed to stand out. And that means in a good way or a bad way. And this is problematic when you are teaching in a Japanese school and you ask people a question and nobody wants to answer. So nobody wants to answer because if you have the right answer, then you're embarrassed because you might look like you're trying to look good. And if you don't know the answer, you don't want to say it because you don't want to look stupid either. So it's very difficult to get people to say anything because they don't want to draw attention to themselves. They don't want to stand out. And ultimately, what that means is that there is this reluctance to be an individual, that people are focused much more on being part of the group. And so as I said, that both of these values are difficult for Americans to grasp. Very counter to how Americans deal with things and how we think about self. And one of the things I think, for me in particular, where I look at this and I think about it for myself, is impatience. So I tend to be impatient. And so, like when I'm driving here, often I am not in my car. I am 2 car lengths ahead at that car with a huge space in front of it that is not going as fast as it could. And I am trying to push that driver to go faster. And I have no control over that at all. And so instead of being in my car at that moment, I am outside of it fighting this battle that I can't win. And even, when I'm walking around in my neighborhood and I push the walk button, and it seems to take forever for the walk button to change. And so, what I've tried to do is look at the sky and say, aren't the clouds pretty today? So, the idea is to stop focusing on what should be happening that you have no control over and get more into what's happening right now at the moment. All right, so a couple of important principles about Japan. One of these is a divide, a social divide, into what they call Soto and Uchi. And Soto is out-group, and Uchi is in-group. And Uchi can be family, but it can also be work, it could be school. But it's the people you are more close to. And basically it's the extent of psychological relatedness that you have to other people. And I think that ultimately it springs from feudal clannishness. And so they have a long history of feudalism in Japan, and you had to focus on your own group's well-being to survive. And so I think that that's a carryover socially. Another important principle is the difference between hone and tatamai. So hone is true feelings. So that's how you feel deep down. Tatamai is the social facade that you present to other people. And so the idea here is that you are much more likely to present tatamai to Soto, people who are outside your in-group. So you're very unlikely to be your true self with others. And again, that means that you have to constantly be vigilant about what other people are expecting, how you're feeling. There's that constant monitoring in the presence of others. And so you're only going to express your hone, your true self, to uchi, the people you are close to. And so by American standards, Japanese people rarely reveal their true selves. And I think that there probably are a lot of Japanese who are not even aware of their hone, not aware of their true feelings. And that's true of Americans too. So again, it's not like all Americans are aware of their true feelings. A lot of people need to go into psychotherapy to figure out how they really feel about things. But I think in Japan, there probably are a lot more people who are out of touch. And that is because you have to be very careful about letting yourself express things that are unacceptable in social settings. I want to mention a little bit about socialization of children. So Japanese mothering is very indulgent. This is something that surprised me as well with being there and learning about this because, Japanese people are very controlled. They're very disciplined. So I thought, well, the parenting must be very disciplined as well. But Japanese mothers are extremely indulgent, extremely permissive, and infants are traditionally rarely separated from the mother. So they're around them all the time, 24/7. And American parenting stresses rules. That we teach children what rules they need to obey. So, you must make your bed, that's what people do. Why do I have to do it? Because that's what people do. So we teach by rules. In Japan, the parenting stresses much more the effect that it has on your behavior has on other people. And so, a Japanese mother might say, it makes mommy sad when you don't make your bed. Okay, so by American standards, this is really manipulative and is not healthy. But by Japanese standards, this gets kids to focus on what is going on with other people. So it shows how our cultural values influence our socialization. So ultimately, Japanese mothers teach their children to fear loneliness. So, they want the children to be motivated to be part of the group. Whereas American mothers teach their kids to be self-sufficient. So they should be able to be alone. Now, one of the things that's interesting, so I said that the mothers are extremely indulgent, but there's this big shift in socialization that happens with kindergarten. And so what happens is that the kids are introduced to something called shudan seikatsu, which is group life. And so they're used to being the center of the world, the mother's indulging them, and suddenly the kindergarten teachers are saying, doesn't matter what you want anymore. This is what we're doing, this is what the group is doing. And so it's moving from self-focused to other-focused. And it's like boot camp. And so I think it's a very rough awakening for a lot of kids because it's this very, very abrupt shift in how people are treated. And there is a subgroup of people in Japan, kikukushigo, which are returnees. And these are people who spent part of their childhood outside of Japan and then came back to Japan. And traditionally, these people have been thought to have some problems caused by this. But actually, most of these people do not seem to have problems. They seem to blend in fairly well, unless they were abroad during a critical period. And if they were abroad during this critical period, they don't really develop a Japanese sense of self. And so they tend to be seen when they come back as self-centered. They tend to be seen as attention-seeking. So you speak up too much. You express your opinion too much. So they come across as nails that need to be hammered down. And so it appears that Japanese kids who were in kindergarten in the US develop a much more American sense of self. And then if they go back to Japan later, they can't get rid of it. So they have this individual sense that they could try to suppress, but they can't change it. And so this has all sorts of effects, that they can be bullied, they can be alienated. So it's a very interesting thing, because it shows the importance of this critical period in terms of expressing this sense of self. All right, and so as we're moving now to the conclusion, what I want to do is talk about challenges in contemporary Japan. So Japanese society is overtly interdependent, which is focused on harmony, and everybody is supposed to get supported by other people. And supposedly Japanese people are able to suppress their feelings without bad outcomes. But currently, Japan has all sorts of social problems. A huge increase in depression in the last 20 years, a chronically high suicide rate, one of the highest in the world. There's endemic bullying in schools. And I actually read a paper by a mental health professional who was saying that bullying is useful because it gets other people to develop a group sense. So if you're all ganging up on the person who's bullied, that is good for you. So yeah, by American standards, it's a horrible thing. But by Japanese standards, that group harmony is what is most important. There also has been an increase in child abuse. And there is this group of people called hikikomori who are, and they're mostly males, mostly happens starting in high school. But these people just drop out. And basically, they just stay in the room. They may go online. They may do social networking type stuff. But they just don't leave. And this may happen for at least 6 months to be labeled this. But it may go on for years. And so there's been a big increase in this as well. Also, in Japan, there's this phenomenon of people being worked to death. And so, you have people who are trying to live up to the expectations of others. And so they may have a heart attack at a young age. There also is a problem with suicide for people who just cannot produce the amount of work that their supervisors are expecting. It's too humiliating, it's shameful for them. So they commit suicide because they can't bear the thought of letting other people down. There's also a rapidly aging population. So, in 20 years, like 30% of the population is going to be 80 years or older. So it's a big problem because who is going to support these older people? And in general, the older social supports are disappearing in Japan. So, there's a paradox. On the one hand, there is high group harmony, but on the other hand, individually, there's a lot of psychopathology. So other challenges. So first of all, Japanese families have little tolerance for mental health problems, and there's a big fear of stigma. So if someone has a mental health problem, if someone sees a therapist, there's a fear of stigma, so that makes it less likely people are going to get help. Often, Japanese are more likely to seek out medical solutions as opposed to psychological solutions. So they'll see a medical doctor, they may get some medication, but they're not really fixing the problem. They may be treating the symptoms. And then lastly, that patients tend to want concrete suggestions from an authority figure. So rather than working on their own problems, they just want to be told what to do. And there's less likely that they're going to discuss their own personal problems. Okay. All right, so these are conundrums. These are things that are, for me, that, that I've been trying to figure out myself. So on the one hand, this interconnectedness promises a sense of belonging, which is a good thing. But it also presents this tremendous pressure. So to be able to belong, you have to not disturb or bother other people. So you get the benefit of belonging, but you have to be constantly vigilant and concerned about doing something that will result in your being excluded. One of the benefits of this is that if you go to Japan, it's incredibly clean, it's quiet, people are polite. And so even in crowded places, the stress level is lower than it is in the US. And considering the population density, it is amazing. But this burden also brings problems, so it can result in a sense of being alienated. And there are unique psychopathologies in Japan that they don't have elsewhere. And a lot of them have to do with concerns, irrational concerns about giving offense to other people. So people believe that they smell bad, even though there's nothing wrong with them. Or they believe that there's something about the way they're looking that may offend other people. So they try not to go into social situations. And despite this interconnectedness that people have, I also observed a lot of socially maladaptive behavior. And so these are things that I didn't think were actually promoting group harmony. One of these is that people openly cough and sneeze in public. So you're riding on the subway, and maybe you got lucky and you have a seat and there's someone standing over you, and that person's just coughing, and they don't cover their mouths. And sometimes people wear masks, but they just openly. And I actually talked to a couple of public health people with the Japanese government. And I said, in the US, they teach us, cough into your sleeve, cough into your shoulder. And they were amazed at this idea. But, so you've got all these people packed together and diseases running around. And people don't do like basic things that they do here, which is try to get people to change their behavior. The other thing I saw was displays of public callousness that really surprised me as well. So you think people are interconnected, they should be very concerned about individuals. But and this is true in America as well. So particularly in larger cities, that when people are in distress, they will be ignored. But in Japan, this happened too, which surprised me. I didn't expect that to happen. And partly I think that was not wanting to embarrass people who are in distress. So like if something's going on with you, you're having a problem, if people ask you if you're okay, you may feel embarrassed about that because you're drawing attention to yourself. So they may avoid helping you because they don't want to embarrass you. But also I think that part of it is that they want to avoid getting stuck or having an obligation. So in America, like let's say someone comes up to you, when you leave here today, someone comes up to you and says, can you help me? Americans usually will say yes, then you find out more about it. And then if that person is asking you for too much, at some point you say, I gotta go. And you're able to extricate yourself from the situation. But I think for Japanese people, it's much more difficult to do that. So once you open yourself up to be helpful, it's much more difficult to say, this is how far I'm willing to go. I'm not going to help you anymore. I'm leaving. So I think Japanese people resist helping others because they don't want to get stuck with always having to help that person. And then partly, I think it's just that if you're Soto, they have less of an obligation to you. So if you're Uchi, if you're close to them, they do have an obligation. All right, and then there's also, I think, Japanese people recognize this, that there is kind of a general sense of alienation. So they're supposed to be interconnected, but there's also this sense of alienation. People don't make eye contact in public. That was one of the things that I found disconcerting, and even foreigners, it would be, and I found myself falling into the same thing. So, there are not that many foreigners in Japan, and you're walking along the street, and hey, there's another foreigner over there, and both of you just don't look at each other. And after a while, I thought, well, this is stupid. Why do I have to do this? So I would look at people, but they wouldn't look at me. But particularly when I first got there and before I knew people, it was like being a ghost. So I would just walk through the streets and nobody saw me at all. I would talk to people in shops or restaurants, but in public it was like I did not exist. And Japanese sometimes refer to themselves as the lonely people. So even though they're connected with each other, there is this alienation. And it's very hard to make friends in Japan. I'm lucky that I have some Japanese students who were my graduate students and moved back to Japan. And so when I go to Japan, I can visit them, and I have visited their families. But that's because I've become somewhat uchi with them. But if you don't know anybody, it's very difficult to become uchi and stop being soto. Okay, so these are kind of like boiled down for me, the kind of central things about Japan that I got out of being there. And the first of these is basically that it's impossible to be a Japanese person. Okay, and it's true. This is like the main idea that I had was just like it is impossible to be a Japanese person because society presents to you these insolubly contradictory demands. So you're supposed to focus on your own feelings so that you don't burden other people, but you're not supposed to focus on your own feelings. You're supposed to engage with other people, but you're not supposed to be demanding of them. So that's where I think a lot of the difficulty that Japanese people have is that the culture is telling them to do two things that they cannot do at the same time. You have to do both of them. You cannot do both of them. One of the things that I also think is extremely important is this idea about interdependent. This may not be true for other cultures that are interdependent, but for Japan, I think it really tends to be a one-way street. That Japanese are willing to sacrifice for other people, they're willing to give up their own needs for the benefit of others, but they're rarely willing to ask for help from others. And so, it's a paradox because if you're interconnected, that should mean you get more support from other people. But I think it's really true that in America, our independence allows us to get more support from others. If I'm having problems, I can go up to you and say, will you help me? But in Japan, because of this interconnectedness, I'm not allowed to ask for help. And so the interdependence actually separates us more. And so, one of the things that despite this interdependence that I realize is Japanese are intensely self-reliant. They may be the most self-reliant people on earth. And that interdependence actually makes people less likely to rely on other people. So there's that paradox there. And they don't want to be a burden. That's a big part of it. But also there's something, I think, where that obligation that I was talking about before, there's something called giri. And giri is social indebtedness. And so Japanese people are afraid of getting into social indebtedness. So if you give a gift to someone, that person is obligated to give you a gift back. And then if I get a gift, and if that person gives you a gift back, you have to give that person a gift again. And so it's like you're stuck for the rest of your life in this pattern of gift giving. So one of the worst things that could happen is someone gives you a gift. And I realized that as an American, I'm not bound by these customs. And so if there was really someone I wanted to get revenge on, I would give that person an extremely generous gift. And that was way out of proportion to our relationship. And that person would feel so horrible about it. Because then that person would have to give me a really generous gift. And so, if these conventions are extremely important. Okay. Another thing that's important here is that, at first, the idea is that Japanese are not competitive, because you don't want to stand out. But what I realized is that Japanese are competitive. I realize this because I'm a fairly fast walker, And I had lots of Japanese who would try to speed up and pass me. And I would speed up a little bit and say, there's no way, you know, my legs are longer. There's no way you're going to pass me. And they wouldn't. But I had lots of people who tried to do that. And what I realized is that, you know, Americans are competitive to be the best. You want to stand out. You want to look good. You want to be better than other people. Japanese people compete not to be the worst. So they don't want to look bad. And so it's a very different thing. So, you know, in Japan, there's very little objective feedback, even in schools. This is what the students would tell me. It's like, we don't know how we're doing. Nobody tells us how we're doing. We don't know how we compare to other people. And so everybody goes with their, you know, what they imagine this ideal other person is. And so nobody knows how they really relate to others in terms of performance. So you have this ideal that you're always competing with. So everybody in Japan is constantly driving themselves to be better than what they imagine other people are doing. So they are competitive, but they don't want to look good. They just don't want to look bad. And everybody thinks they're the worst. So they're always working not to be the worst. And then I think Japanese people have this intense ambivalence about self-awareness. So you have to know yourself well enough that you don't burden other people with your own stuff. But I think there also is this recoil from your own desires, from hone, because you don't want to be too self-involved. So you have to know yourself well enough that you don't express it and bother other people, but you shouldn't be so self-involved that you're really thinking a lot about yourself. And then lastly, this is something for me that was really difficult to kind of grasp. When I was walking on sidewalks, you know, in America, when you're walking on a sidewalk, you look at the people who are coming towards you, you make eye contact, you can tell where they're going. In Japan, people don't make eye contact, they don't look where they're going. I had a very difficult time figuring out how not to run into everybody. And the sidewalks are not orderly. I expected that in Japan, but they're not, they're pretty chaotic. And I was talking with the wife of another Fulbright person about this, that I couldn't figure out where people are focused because they're not looking. And she said that she thinks Japanese people have a very peripheral focus. And so you're not focused on what's ahead of you, you're focused on what's around you. And so there's kind of a flock or a school mentality. So it's not like, you know, I think when I'm walking through a crowd, I'm having all of these different encounters with individuals. And I'm kind of threading my way through so we don't, you know, each person we don't bump into each other. And in Japan, they don't do that. It's just like somehow people don't smash into each other all the time. But for me, I had to really, you know, I was not able to navigate that the way Japanese people can. All right, so solutions. You know, solutions are difficult because they mostly focus on promoting individual welfare, I think, and that runs counter to the whole Japanese culture. So that necessitates some change in culture. And the question really is, you know, can Japanese culture continue to remain the same and Japanese society not just basically fall apart? And I'm not so sure that it can, you know, based on the aging population and other type of social problems. So one thing is more focus on individual well-being, particularly in the workplace. The workplace is just a meat grinder for a lot of people in Japan. Second, more focus on own well-being. So getting people more comfortable with, you know, asking themselves, do I feel okay? Do I need help? If I need help, can I ask for help? And so increasing people's skills for mood regulation, I think, is one way to do this. Also, more societal supports for women. They have an extremely low birth rate in Japan right now because a lot of women feel like it's not worth it to them to have kids. And so, you know, very few supports. There's very difficult to get daycare there. So if they had things that helped women, more maternity leave, more daycare, that would be helpful. And then lastly, more availability of psychotherapy. Very few people get psychotherapy in Japan, not very available. And there has to be a promotion of it as something that's socially acceptable. And so right now, there still is that big stigma that it has to overcome. And so, so if you're interested in further reading, so these are a few books that I think are useful, that are interesting, and that are accessible to people who are not psychologists as well. So I have some time to take questions if people, yes?
Sorry. So you mentioned you were trying to identify what American therapies or
Right.
methodologies could be used in Japan. Did you ever consider it the other way? What kind of, from Japan, or what kind of?
Well, I do think the mindfulness is something that is being embraced a lot more here. The kind of homegrown Japanese therapies are really strange by American standards. And the focus is a lot on kind of accepting your own poor functioning as a member of the group. And so I think that that's difficult for Americans to really embrace as well.
Okay, so my second part is, I mean, I'm Chinese American,
Yeah.
born here, raised here, so I don't think I have that mindset, but I understand a lot of that stuff and have seen it and, kind of been brought up with it, but it was always kind of in the back, like, you apologize for something you haven't done. And we would see people do that, but we know, oh, they're just being polite. So anyway, so my question is, in your clinical teaching here in the States, do you teach your students anything about the Asian mentality? Because I think it's very difficult here for Asians to seek treatment because of these cultural.
Absolutely. So that's a big problem, right? And so, fortunately, we have a lot more Asian students coming through, and many of them are bilingual, and so that's important, and bicultural as well. But you're right. It's very difficult to get Asians to come into therapy because of stigma, other types of prohibitions. So yes, and so particularly. I've been interested in culture for a while, so in my classes I've been incorporating it more. And then after being in Japan, I've emphasized it even more. And our students do, part of California licensure requirements is there has to be a class in cross-cultural psychology. So that's part of the training as well. And so so you do have to take into consideration where clients are coming from culturally. And sometimes they do need something of a shift. But also you have to understand where they're coming from, and culture is a big part of it. So so that is very important. Okay. Yes?
I taught Koreans and Japanese at a Korean school, and I had to work with getting them to ask questions and also to tell me what it was they did that I wasn't putting across correctly. And they were very reluctant, but once they realized how thrilled I was that they were asking questions and that they were letting me know what I needed to stress, that kind of thing, you could see the joy on their faces. Mm-hmm. The problem was many of these were going back to Japan or back to Korea. How could I have gotten them ready for that transition?
How old were they?
They were junior high most.
Yes, I would say that by that time they probably had been socialized already. But I had the same problem with trying to get students to ask questions in my classes. And I was only there 6 months, and it wasn't long enough really to get them to come out of their shells.
But once they've got that freedom, it's really hard to put the freedom back in the bottle.
Yeah, although I think Japanese people are very good at compartmentalizing. And so they know which people that they can be more open with and which people they can't be. So I think, if they had gone to kindergarten in the US, and they hadn't really developed a Japanese sense of self, then I think that's more of a problem. But if they developed the Japanese sense of self and they went to school here for a while, I think that definitely opens them up. And I found, like what you're talking about, that Japanese people were really interested in talking about Japan, Japanese culture, with someone who was not Japanese, because they were trying to understand things themselves. So I agree with that, but I also think that it's not completely like the genie is out of the bottle. That it's possible to moderate one's behavior depending on the situation. But I do think it adds another dimension to themselves that people who are not outside of the U.S. are able to do. The other thing that I would say too is that one of the things I've noticed about international students who come to the U.S., particularly for women, is they don't want to be locked into the cultural expectations. And so one of the things that coming to the US for school allows them to do is be more themselves. So it appeals to certain people. Yes?
When we traveled to Japan, we were advised that when you're walking on the sidewalk, you don't say, "Excuse me." And the reason you don't is because you know where everybody is, so you don't bump into people. And it was really, do you remember when Tom told us that, Joyce? He said, you don't say, excuse me, in English or Japanese, because he says you're not going to bump into people. He said, and what you said about the peripheral vision, they do have it. It's confusing on the street, but they're not bumping into each other. They're just moving fast. So we did see that peripheral vision. They know where others are. The other thing is, if you think it's hard to be Japanese here and be raised by first and second generation from Japan. So you're raised by parents who have a very strong Japanese influence in your life, but you grow up in American schools and you have friends from a different culture, really, than what you are. And I think it comes with some unique challenges.
Yeah, and that's particularly true for Southern California because you have so many people from all over the place and you have cultures that are interacting or potentially clashing with each other. And, you know, I've noticed at Cal State Fullerton that students, I used to do undergraduate advisement, and I think it was more common with women that, you know, a lot of cultures did not support women going to college. And so the women wanted to do that. They wanted to get their degree. The family's saying, you know, you're getting kind of old, you're 20 years old, maybe you should get married. And so they did not have the family support. And so, yeah, so, you know, particularly in a place like California, you have a lot of immigrants, and the shift between the home country culture and the American culture and the clashes between that, and navigating that is very difficult for people to do. It's a real challenge. Yes?
In your view, the evolution, the cultural evolution of Japan, what are the positives of this rootness or interconnectivity?
Well, you know, I envied the feeling of belonging that people had, and the not needing to stand out, not needing to make yourself special. You know, there's less pressure in that sense. So, you know, I think the negative pressures and the positive pressures, you know, they kind of balance each other out. And the fact that, you know, you have a huge number of people living in a small part of the land space, and that they're able to get along with each other and able to, you know, have this harmony, and it's a clean place and it's a polite place. There are really intense benefits to that. So I enjoyed living there, and in some ways it was less, you know, even though I was a foreigner, it was less stressful than living here. Yes?
That was recent though, but if you go back 500 years, 600 years, which is probably where all this developed, I'm thinking that maybe they survived and procreating better by having this.
No, absolutely. You know, I think that Japan historically has had a huge amount of conflict, and there's not a lot of arable land, and so the food supplies were short, so you had to focus on your own people to make sure that you survived. And, you know, the harmony, I think, has been focused on smaller and smaller groups in the past, and that it's only relatively recently that the harmony is seen as being a whole country.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yes.
Mental hospitals, are there any people in them because there's such an antagonism toward?
Yeah, well, they really don't have very many mental hospitals, and so most people who have mental problems that are chronic, I think, are really going to be taken care of by the family, and it's something that's shameful, so you kind of hide this person who has these problems. And so in general, it's hard to get people to be in treatment. And so even just in clinics, not hospitals, there are clinics, there are psychologists who work there, but, you know, compared to the number of psychologists and therapists that you have in the US per capita, it's very small in Japan. Sorry.